The city was alive with movement. Cars honking, people rushing past, their faces buried in their phones, lost in their own worlds. A cold wind blew through the busy street, but no one seemed to notice except for one man, sitting against a brick wall, his coat tattered and thin. He was an older man, maybe in his late 50s, with a thick beard streaked with gray. His boots were worn down, barely holding together. He sat silently, his hands tucked into his sleeves for warmth, a small cardboard sign resting beside him. The words, written in shaky handwriting, read, "Veteran. Hungry. Anything helps." People passed by without a second glance, their eyes fixed ahead, pretending not to see. Some looked uncomfortable, as if his presence was an inconvenience. Others walked right around him, as if he was invisible. Then, Jason Statham stepped out of a nearby cafe, sipping a coffee. He took one look at the man and stopped. Unlike everyone else, he saw him. Really saw him. For a moment, they locked eyes. The veteran looked away, as if expecting Jason to walk past like the rest. But Jason did not walk away. He took a slow step forward, and everything changed. Jason stood there, coffee in hand, studying the man before him. The veteran, feeling the weight of Jason's gaze, shifted uncomfortably. He was used to people looking away, not stopping. His name was Frank Carter, a former Marine who had served his country with honor. Years ago, he had been a strong and capable soldier, a man with purpose and discipline. But life after service had not been kind to him. Struggles with PTSD, an injury that left him unable to work, and the slow unraveling of his personal life had led him to this moment, alone on the streets, forgotten by the world he once swore to protect. Jason noticed everything. The way Frank held himself, the way his eyes darted around, not out of fear, but out of habit, scanning his surroundings like a man who had spent years relying on his instincts. He also noticed the small military patch stitched onto Frank's torn jacket, almost hidden beneath layers of wear and dirt. Jason crouched down, meeting Frank at eye level. "Hey, mate," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Rough day." Frank hesitated before nodding slightly. "You could say that," he muttered. His voice was deep but hoarse, as if he had not spoken much in a long time. Jason reached into his pocket, pulling out a few bills. "Here, grab yourself a warm meal." Frank looked at the money but did not reach for it. "I appreciate it," he said slowly, "but I am not looking for handouts." Jason respected that. He had met many tough men in his life, but there was something about Frank's quiet dignity that struck a chord. He was not just another man on the street. He was a warrior who had been left behind. Jason glanced around. The people who had ignored Frank moments ago were now sneaking glances, watching their interaction with mild curiosity. Jason did not care about the attention. "I was not offering charity," Jason said, placing the bills on Frank's knee. "Just some respect." Frank looked at the money again, his fingers twitching slightly, but still, he did not pick it up. Jason could see that Frank needed more than just cash. He needed someone to acknowledge him, not as a homeless man, but as a human being. So, instead of walking away, Jason sat down beside him on the cold pavement. People stared. But Jason did not move. Frank glanced at him, confusion flickering in his tired eyes. "You do not have to do that." Jason smiled slightly. "I know." For the first time in a long while, Frank felt something other than exhaustion. He felt seen. Frank shifted slightly, and used to someone sitting beside him, especially not someone like Jason. Most people barely spared him a glance. Some dropped a few coins out of guilt, while others walked past, pretending he did not exist. But Jason was different. He did not just toss money and leave, he stayed. The city continued to move around them. Car horns honked in the distance. Footsteps tapped against the pavement. The chatter of strangers filled the air. But in this small pocket of the world, it was just Frank and Jason, two men from very different walks of life sitting side by side. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Frank exhaled, shifting his gaze toward Jason. His voice was rough, worn down by years of hardship. "You do not have to sit here, you know. People like me, we are used to being ignored." Jason did not look away. His expression was calm, steady. No one should be ignored, especially not someone who fought for their country. His sharp eyes had caught the faded military patch on Frank's jacket, barely hanging by a few loose threads. Frank stiffened slightly, his fingers brushing over the worn fabric as if trying to straighten it. After a moment, he gave a small nod. Yeah. Marine Corps. 2 tours overseas. Jason's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his tone steady. That is no small thing. Frank let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. It used to mean something. He paused, as if weighing his next words. Got injured on my last tour. Spent months in recovery. By the time I got back, everything was different. My body was not the same. My mind was not the same. His voice faltered. He glanced down at his hands, rough and calloused, gripping the edge of his tattered coat. Could not hold down a job. The bills kept piling up. My wife. She tried to hold on, but I was not the man she married anymore. Jason remained silent, letting Frank speak. He understood what it meant to carry a weight too heavy to bear alone. Frank exhaled slowly. She left. Took the kids. And I do not blame her. His voice was quiet now, almost as if he was confessing something to himself. I lost the house. Lost everything. He stopped himself, shaking his head. Now, I just get by. He motioned toward the street, at the endless stream of people walking past them. To them, I am just another guy on the sidewalk. Jason nodded, but there was something firm in his voice when he spoke. You are not just another guy. You are a fighter. Frank scoffed. Maybe I was. Jason's gaze was unwavering. No. You still are. You are here. You are surviving. That takes strength. Frank looked at him carefully, as if trying to understand what Jason saw in him. You talk like you have seen things. Jason gave a small, knowing smile but did not elaborate. I have seen enough to know that no one should be left behind. For a long moment, Frank was silent. The wind picked up slightly, rustling his thin coat. He looked down at the folded bills Jason had placed on his knee earlier. His fingers trembled slightly as he picked them up, running his thumb over the paper. He was not a stranger to handouts. But this felt different. Slowly, he tucked the money into his pocket and cleared his throat. Thank you, he said, his voice quieter this time. Jason nodded. That is a start. But I think we can do better than a couple of bucks. Frank frowned. What do you mean? Jason stood up and stretched slightly, then turned back to him and extended a hand. Come on. Let's get you something warm to eat. And after that, we will figure out how to get you back on your feet. Frank stared at Jason's outstretched hand. He had been offered money before. He had been tossed scraps, given pity, and forgotten the next day. But this was different. Jason was offering more than food. He was offering something Frank had not felt in a long time. Hope. His fingers twitched, hesitating. His pride told him to refuse. But his hunger, his exhaustion, and that small part of him that still wanted to believe told him to reach out. Slowly, he lifted his hand and placed it in Jason's. Jason's grip was firm, steady. And for the first time in a long time, Frank felt like he was standing for something again. Jason led Frank through the crowded streets, keeping his pace slow to match the older man's steps. Frank walked with a slight limp, his body worn down by years of hardship. The city buzzed around them, car horns, laughter from nearby restaurants, and the occasional distant siren. But for Frank, it felt different this time. He was not just another forgotten face in the crowd. They reached a small diner on the corner of the street, its neon sign flickering. It was not fancy, but it looked warm and welcoming. Jason pushed the door open, the little bell above it jingling softly. A waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, looked up from behind the counter. "Hey there, Jason," she greeted with a smile. "You are in early today." Jason nodded. "Hey, Linda. Got a friend with me today." He gestured toward Frank, who hesitated just inside the doorway. Linda's smile did not waver. "Well, any friend of yours is welcome here." She grabbed 2 menus and motioned to a booth by the window. Take a seat. I will be right over. Jason patted Frank on the back gently, urging him forward. Come on, sit down. Frank slid into the booth cautiously, as if unsure whether he truly belonged there. The last time he had eaten in a restaurant felt like a lifetime ago. His usual meals were whatever he could scavenge or afford: cheap fast food, leftover scraps, or handouts from shelters. Jason sat across from him, pushing a menu in his direction. Order whatever you want. Frank's fingers hovered over the laminated pages. I do not know, he muttered. Maybe just coffee. Jason shook his head. Not happening. You need real food. Linda returned, pen in hand. What can I get you boys? Jason glanced at Frank, waiting. After a long pause, Frank finally cleared his throat. A burger and fries, he said, almost like he was afraid to ask for more. Linda nodded. Coming right up. She jotted it down, then turned to Jason. The usual for you? Yeah, Jason said with a small smile. As Linda walked away, Frank exhaled, rubbing his hands together. I appreciate this, he said, but I cannot keep taking handouts. Jason leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. It is not a handout. It is a start. Frank looked out the window, watching people pass by. I have tried getting back on my feet before. It never sticks. Every time I think I am making progress, something knocks me down again. Jason nodded, understanding. It is hard. But you fought battles before, tougher than this. Frank chuckled bitterly. Yeah, but I had a squad back then. I was not alone. Jason's expression hardened. You are not alone now either. Frank met his gaze, surprised by the sincerity in Jason's voice. A few minutes later, Linda returned with their meals, placing a steaming plate in front of Frank. The smell alone made his stomach tighten with hunger. He picked up the burger carefully, almost reverently, and took a bite. The warmth, the taste, it was more than just food. It was dignity. Jason let him eat in silence, giving him time to enjoy it. When Frank finally slowed down, Jason spoke again. Do you want to get off the streets? Frank wiped his mouth with a napkin and sighed. Of course I do. Then let's make a plan, Jason said. You need a place to stay first. Frank shook his head. I have been to shelters. They are rough. I would rather sleep outside. Jason thought for a moment. I know a place, a veteran support center. They help guys like you find housing and work. You would have a bed, a shower, real support. Frank frowned. Places like that, they usually have waiting lists. Jason smirked. Yeah, for most people. But I have a few connections. Frank narrowed his eyes. Why are you doing this? Jason leaned back in his seat. Because you deserve better. Frank swallowed hard. He was not used to kindness without conditions. Jason pulled out his phone. Let me make a call. Frank watched as Jason spoke with someone, his tone firm yet respectful. Within minutes, he had arranged for Frank to meet with the head of the Veteran Center. Jason ended the call and looked at him. They have a bed open. If you are willing, I will take you there now. Frank hesitated. A part of him wanted to say no, to keep drifting like he always had. But another part of him, the part that had been waiting for a second chance, wanted to believe this could be real. Finally, he nodded. Okay. Jason smiled. Good. Let's get moving. Frank finished the last of his meal, savoring every bite. As they stepped back onto the sidewalk, Jason hailed a cab. For the first time in a long time, Frank felt like he was heading somewhere worth going. Jason and Frank stepped out of the diner and onto the bustling sidewalk. The evening air had grown cooler, and the neon signs from surrounding shops flickered in the dimming light. Jason glanced at Frank, noting the way he clutched his jacket closer to his frame, his body still tense, as if he was afraid this moment of kindness might slip away at any second. We have got a ride coming, Jason said, nodding towards the curb where a taxi was pulling up. Let's get you to that veteran center. Frank hesitated for a second, his fingers fidgeting as he looked down the street. The thought of moving forward, of trusting that this was not just another dead end, made his heart pound. But he took a deep breath and nodded. All right. As they climbed into the taxi, Jason gave the driver the address, then turned back to Frank. This place is not just another shelter. It is a support network. You will have access to counselors, job placement programs, even healthcare services. Frank scoffed lightly, staring out the window. Sounds too good to be true. Jason studied him for a moment before speaking. You fought for this country. You gave years of your life to serve. You deserve to have a place where people care. Frank turned to look at him. His eyes tired but filled with a glimmer of something that had long been missing. Hope. The cab pulled up in front of a well-kept brick building with a sign that read Veteran Support and Housing Initiative. The entrance was warmly lit, and a few men in their 40s and 50s sat on the front steps, chatting quietly. Frank shifted in his seat, his nerves creeping back in. Come on, Jason said, stepping out first. He waited for Frank to follow before leading him up the steps. A man in a navy sweater and slacks approached them with a welcoming smile. Jason. Good to see you again. He extended a hand. Jason shook it firmly. Good to see you too, Mark. This is Frank. He is looking for a fresh start. Mark turned to Frank and offered his hand. Glad to have you here, Frank. We will get you settled. Frank hesitated before shaking his hand. Thanks, he muttered. Mark gestured toward the entrance. Come on inside. We will get you set up with a bed and a warm shower. As they stepped in, the air inside felt different from what Frank had expected. It was not a cold, sterile facility. The walls were lined with photos of veterans, smiling faces of those who had walked this path before him. A faint smell of coffee and home-cooked food lingered in the air, a stark contrast to the harsh city streets he had grown used to. Jason walked beside Frank as Mark led them through the hallways. This place is run by people who understand. Most of them are veterans themselves. Frank nodded but said nothing. He was still trying to believe this was real. Mark led them into an office where a woman in a professional but warm outfit greeted them. Frank, we are going to get you started with a room, some fresh clothes, and a medical checkup. Frank swallowed, nodding again. It had been so long since anyone had treated him like a person rather than just another homeless man on the street. Jason turned to him. This is your chance to take back your life, Frank. Frank met his gaze, emotion threatening to surface. I do not know how to thank you for this. Jason clapped a hand on his shoulder. You do not have to. Just promise me you will not give up on yourself. Frank exhaled deeply, then nodded. All right. Jason watched as Frank was led toward his new room. For the first time in years, Frank had a bed to sleep in, a place where he belonged. And for Jason, knowing he had made a difference in one man's life was more rewarding than any action film or fight scene. As Jason stepped back outside, he looked up at the night sky, a small smile on his face. Sometimes, being a real hero was not about throwing punches. It was about lifting someone up when they had fallen the hardest. He took one last glance at the building, then turned and walked into the night, ready for whatever came next. As the cab pulled up to a modest but clean hotel, Frank looked out the window, his brows furrowed in confusion. He had expected Jason to take him straight to the Veterans Center. Not here. Jason paid the driver and gestured for Frank to step out. The cool night air greeted them as they walked toward the entrance. Frank hesitated, glancing at Jason. Why are we here? Jason gave him a reassuring look. You have been out on the streets for too long. Before you start a new chapter, you need a good night's sleep, a hot shower, and some real rest. Frank shook his head. I do not need a hotel. I will be fine at the center. Jason crossed his arms. Just humor me, all right? Frank sighed but followed Jason inside. The lobby was quiet, warmly lit, and smelled of fresh coffee. The receptionist, a young woman with a friendly smile, greeted them. Jason handed over his card. One room for my friend here. Frank watched in stunned silence as Jason handled everything effortlessly. He had not been in a hotel in years, probably since before his life took a downward spiral. A few minutes later, they stood outside the hotel room. Jason handed Frank the key. Go in, take a shower, and rest. Frank hesitated, his fingers gripping the key tightly. I do not know how to thank you. Jason smiled. You do not have to. Just take care of yourself. Frank nodded, then entered the room, closing the door behind him. The moment he stepped inside, he was overwhelmed. A real bed. Clean sheets. A bathroom with warm water. He sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand over the soft comforter. For the first time in a long time, he felt human again. Meanwhile, Jason made another call. He was not done yet. He had already arranged for Frank to meet with the Veteran Center, but he wanted to do more. He reached out to an old friend who ran a security firm, explaining Frank's situation. By the end of the conversation, he had secured a potential job interview for Frank, if he was ready for it. The next morning, Jason returned to the hotel. He knocked on the door, and Frank opened it, looking noticeably better. His eyes were brighter, and for the first time, he did not seem weighed down by exhaustion. Jason held up a bag of clothes. Thought you might need these. Frank took the bag, looking inside. Fresh jeans, a button-up shirt, sturdy boots. He swallowed hard, overwhelmed. Jason, this is too much. Jason shrugged. You have got an interview this afternoon. Frank's eyes widened. Interview. Jason nodded. It is a security job. You have got the experience. They are willing to meet with you. Frank ran a hand through his graying hair. I do not know what to say. Say yes, Jason said simply. One step at a time. Frank took a deep breath and nodded. All right. I will do it. Jason grinned. Good man. As Frank changed into his new clothes, he saw himself in the mirror. For the first time in years, he did not just see a homeless man. He saw a veteran, a survivor, someone who still had a future. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. In the days that followed, Frank's transformation was nothing short of inspiring. News of Jason's act of kindness spread quickly, thanks to onlookers who had witnessed the moment in the diner and shared it on social media. The story of a Hollywood action star helping a homeless veteran struck a chord with people everywhere. Frank, now clean-shaven and dressed in the new clothes Jason had provided, began to carry himself differently. The weight that had bowed his shoulders seemed lighter, replaced by a glimmer of hope. At the Veteran Support Center, he found himself surrounded by others who understood his struggles. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere. Jason, true to his word, kept in touch. He checked on Frank's progress regularly, offering encouragement and resources. But what neither of them could have anticipated was the ripple effect Jason's actions would create. The story reached local news outlets and eventually gained national attention. People were moved by the simplicity and sincerity of the gesture. Donations began pouring into the Veteran Support Center, allowing it to expand its reach and help more individuals like Frank. Volunteers signed up in droves, inspired to give their time to a cause that often went overlooked. Frank himself became somewhat of a symbol for resilience and second chances. He was invited to share his story at community events and veteran gatherings, where his honesty and humility resonated deeply with audiences. It was not just about what Jason did for me, he would say. It was about what he showed me, that people still care. That kindness can make a difference. The bar where it all started also saw a shift. Regulars began talking more about ways to support the homeless community in their area. Some organized food drives, while others reached out to local shelters. The bartender, who had watched the entire scene unfold, set up a donation jar to help fund meals for those in need. Jason, however, remained humble about his role in it all. When asked about his actions in interviews, he would shrug and say, "It was the right thing to do. Frank fought for this country. The least we can do is fight for him when he needs it." Frank's journey was far from over, but he was no longer walking it alone. And as word of Jason's kindness continued to spread, it sparked countless acts of generosity from people who wanted to make a difference in their own communities. What began as a simple meal and conversation had become something much larger, a reminder of the power of compassion and the profound impact one person can have when they choose to care. In helping Frank find his footing, Jason had not just changed one life. He had inspired many others to do the same. As Jason stood outside the Veteran Support Center, Watching Frank walk through the doors with renewed hope, he could not help but reflect on how small actions could lead to profound change. The moment was a reminder that every life has value, and sometimes all it takes is one person to believe in another to spark a transformation. The streets, which had seemed cold and indifferent earlier, now felt different to Jason. He had always believed in doing what was right, but this experience reinforced just how much of a difference one act of kindness could make. Frank's journey was not over. There would still be challenges ahead, but Jason knew that the first step was often the hardest. And today, they had taken that step together. Jason's act of kindness did not go unnoticed. Onlookers who had witnessed his interaction with Frank earlier began to share the story, and it quickly gained attention on social media. People were inspired by the way Jason treated Frank, with dignity, respect, and genuine care. It was not about fame or recognition for Jason. It was about doing what felt right. But the ripple effect of his actions was undeniable. Messages began pouring in from people who had seen the story online. Veterans shared their struggles and thanked Jason for shining a light on their plight. Strangers offered to donate to veteran support programs, and local businesses reached out with offers to help provide housing and jobs for those in need. What started as one man helping another had grown into a movement of compassion and generosity. Frank's life took a turn for the better. With the support of the Veteran Center and Jason's continued encouragement, he found stability. He began attending counseling sessions to address the trauma that had haunted him for years. Slowly but surely, he started to rebuild his life. The pride he once felt as a soldier began to return, and with it, a sense of purpose. Jason, on the other hand, remained humble. When reporters tried to reach out for interviews, he declined, stating simply that the focus should be on helping others, not on him. "This is not about me," he said. "It is about people like Frank who deserve a second chance." The story served as a powerful reminder to everyone who heard it. Kindness does not require grand gestures or deep pockets. It starts with empathy and the willingness to act. Jason's decision to stop and help Frank was a lesson for all, that we each have the power to make a difference in someone's life, no matter how small the act may seem. As Jason walked away from the Veteran Center, he felt a sense of fulfillment that no amount of fame or fortune could bring. He knew the world could be harsh and unforgiving, but moments like these proved that humanity still had the capacity for goodness. And sometimes, it just took one person to light the way for others to follow.